Welcome back, soul friends. It's Tannaz, your host of the Minutes on Growth podcast. And today I have a very special guest with us, author and season guide, HeatherAsh Amara. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tannaz. I'm so grateful to be here with you.
I'm a big fan of your work. I've been following you for many years. I've read your Warrior Goddess training book. But for those who don't know you, which I'm surprised by. You all should know her. But for those who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Yes, I have always been a writer. I started to write my first book when I was 7 years old, and am really blessed to have written 9 books at this point. And I really love helping people to undo old agreements and belief systems, to find their courage, their compassion, and their creativity. And I get to travel around the world loving people and writing.
I love that. When I was reading your story about, that desire to write your first book at 7, I was thinking to myself, wow, she was like literally brought into this world with this dharma in her heart. What made you follow on that desire?
Mm. Well, it's funny because I didn't follow on that desire right away. I think, as so many of us do, where I had this knowing. And then when I started writing as a 7-year-old, I was like, I'm going to write a book. And I realized pretty quickly, I don't have enough experience. I don't know what I would write about. And so I kind of went off and lived my life. But that burning inside of me continued, and I ended up following it in a lot of different ways of high school newspaper and then college newspaper, and kept following this thread of something that felt like home to me, even when it was difficult. And it wasn't until I worked for a publisher for a while and was a publicist actually for Don Miguel and the Four Agreements. And so I got to watch that book do its huge thing. And I had my publisher, my boss, said to me, what do you really, really want to do with your life? Like, what do you really want? And I said to her, I want to write full time and I want to teach full time. And she's like, okay, let's make it happen. So I just had an incredible mentor who believed in me and helped me to take that next step to follow my heart and trust that I could make it happen. And it was scary a lot of the times, but it's also been incredible, incredible journey.
Wow. I want to touch on something you said. You said even when it was difficult. And so I'd like you to open up that topic for us because sometimes people think when there is this desire within us or when we're born with a certain talent that it just needs to feel easy. And if it doesn't feel easy, then it's not aligned with us. What's your thought on that?
Mm. That is not true. That there's a there's a difference between something being easy and something that feels worthwhile and important, that is challenging. And that even when the challenges arise, it doesn't mean don't go here. I feel like when we really want something and we feel like it's our dharma, we feel like it's a calling, that we also understand there's going to be challenges and that the road's definitely not easy. And I think a lot of people turn away from their heart's desires because the challenge arises and they're immediately like, oh, see, must not be for me. And yet I always believe that when an obstacle arises, it's the universe saying, wonderful, that's what you want, then clean this up. There's some belief or agreement that's now being shown through the obstacle, which is the thing that needs to be cleaned up so that you can keep moving.
Mm, so powerful. If you're open to it, can you share with us some of those beliefs that came up for you when you were transitioning into becoming an author?
Absolutely. I've got 2 really good stories. One was before I'd even written a book, and I was in a bookstore. I was holding a cup of tea. It was my favorite bookstore, and I was like in just heaven, looking at all the spiritual books. And I left and I got into my car and I realized in the like 5 minutes it had taken me to get from that bookstore to my car, I felt depressed, defeated, and like something was wrong.
Mhm.
And I And luckily I'd been doing enough spiritual work at that point that I was able to pause and go back and look at what happened. I knew I had been really happy, and then suddenly I was not. And what I recognized as I scanned back, I did something called recapitulation, which is a practice to really look at what happened with your energy. And when I went back, I realized that as I was looking at all these books, that there was a little voice in my head that said, all the books have already been written. You shouldn't, why do you want to write a book and choke the world on another book? It's already been written. You don't have anything original to say. But that voice had been so quiet that I hadn't caught it at the moment. But luckily I caught it quick enough that I was able to redirect and say, no, even if nobody reads a book, I want to write a book. That's something that I want to do for myself. And I know now, if I hadn't caught that voice, I may not never have written. So we have to be honest with ourselves of where our own inner critic or judge is trying to dampen our passion and creativity, because it's afraid. It's scary to be an artist and a creative. It's scary to go for our dreams and to be vulnerable in that way and put ourselves out there. So that was my first story. And the second story is kind of funny now, is the first book that I wrote. I think I was 34 when I wrote my first book. And I like forced it. Like I didn't know how to write. I knew how to write articles. I've been a journalist for a long time, but I didn't know how to do a book. And I would just sit myself down, like force myself to write every day for 3 months. And I got to the end and I read it and I was like, this is a terrible book. It was really heady. It was not me. It was from my mind trying to do something hard. And I had to throw the entire thing away and start over. And luckily I had enough support in my life, I could say, like enough encouragement, that I just went, all right, that didn't work. Let me try it a different way. And I had to rewrite it many times before I found my voice. And I think that's the other thing, is that as creatives, as people that are going for our dreams, we have to understand the first time may not work at all. And that's okay. We're learning. And so to give ourselves the grace and the support, both with the people that are around us and also in our own heart, to be rough and not know our voice and not be sure how to do it until we've done something enough that we find our own way. And that can take years, but it's worth it.
So you feel like your voice is becoming more and more maybe comfortable being its true authentic self as the years go by and the more books you put out?
Definitely. And then I've also gotten to explore. So I feel like I found my voice through the first 8 books, and the voice is pretty consistent.
Mhm.
And then this last book I wrote, I wanted to do something different. So I actually started writing a memoir, and it was really intense. Like I had a very intense portion of my life that I was writing about. And I started writing it right in the middle of the pandemic or towards the beginning. And my business coach at one point was like, are you sure you want to be writing a really difficult book right now? And are you sure people want to read a really difficult book? And I was like, oh, right. Probably nobody wants to read this book just because we're all struggling so much. And so I started to write a much more lighthearted book. I found a couple books that I liked that made me like open my heart and that felt simple enough. Like I could do work with myself, even in really extreme case, like we were all navigating the pandemic. So I was like, okay, I want to write a lighthearted book that is also really deep, but it's easy to get into. And that even with our fractured attention spans and what we were all navigating. And so I got to change my voice, which was actually really fun, but really hard too. Because
Wow.
I would write for a while and I would find the kind of that lightheartedness, and then I would go away from it for a while and I would come back and I'd be like, right, where is that voice? Because I wasn't used to it. So it took me a while to get there, and I had to get a lot more support. I got a couple of really good editors to help me to make it consistent. So I think that when we find our voice, there's a way. I mean, we see this like with Taylor Swift or with like a lot of different artists, that they find their niche and then they're like, well, let me try something else.
Mhm.
And it just means you need more help in a way to make the shift, and courage to go into unknown territory.
Right. I was just going to ask about that of like, how did you cultivate that courage to do something you haven't done, you know, 8 books, and it's suddenly so different, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. So like the external circumstances look different. The internal voice is sounding different. How did you silence the inner critic? Did the inner critic even show up and be like, what if this fails? What if no one
Oh,
resonates with this voice of yours?
yes. Yes, it totally showed up. I mean, I had one of my closest friends who's known me for the longest time read an early edition, was like, this is terrible.
Wow.
Like, this is not good. This is not good writing. This is not your best. And I was like, oh no, what if I've made a huge mistake? Because at that point, the publisher was behind it and there was energy behind it. And I had to keep going back to, what's my intent for writing this book? And who am I writing it to? And that's really what gave me courage, was to keep quieting the inner fear and the judge and just be like, we're doing something different. It's okay. It's going to be uncomfortable. And I think that's something about, like, being in the world. The more that we can learn to be uncomfortable and be in relationship to the unknown, the more courageous we get. So it's not even courageous around a particular thing. It's just courageous being uncomfortable, and courageous being knowing that I'm going to disappoint people sometimes, and courageous to try new things.
Mm.
And I just kept going back in and trying again, and getting clear with, who am I writing this to? And then what started happening is I would give drafts out to people, and people would come back to me like, that completely changed my life. And this is still probably an early draft, and they're like, completely shifted their perception of self and gave them something to grasp onto. I'm like, okay, I'm getting closer, of it being simple, but also incredibly transformative. And so I just kept writing draft after draft, and then having the editor, and then rewriting, and then sending it to the person who at first was like, I don't like this. And then being like, it's better. Yeah, it's better. I see it.
Mm. So being open to feedback, being flexible, being resilient, having a strong support system, all of these kind of contributed. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable, all of these played a role. In,
All of these played a role.
mm,
And I'd say another thing was, like, there's a tenacity that we have to have when we're going for our dreams, that we know that there's going to be opposition from ourselves. The part of us that wants to keep us safe. All of us has these different parts that are trying to navigate that we never get hurt again, or that we never make a mistake, or that everybody loves me. And I just know for myself, like, I want everyone to love me. That's one of my core things, of like, if everyone just loved me, I'd be okay. That
mhm,
played out a lot when I was young. And as I've gotten older, that just doesn't have as much of a hold on me anymore. It still shows up for sure. And I also know not everybody's going to love me, and that's okay. And there's a tenacity then of doing something, even if it's just for one person. And what started happening is I started just falling in love with the process of finding a new voice. And
mm.
it became a joy. And I knew when I could make myself laugh about something, and then share it with somebody else, and they also laughed. I mean, I can't tell you how many times somebody's reading and I'm like, they're getting to the part, will they laugh? Is it really funny, or is it just me? And they get to the part, they'd be like, this is hilarious. So
I love.
it became fun then.
Mm. Do you think fun is an element that needs to be part of the process? Did you experience that with the other 8 books, or was it just with this?
Can help. I didn't experience with all the other books for sure, because a lot of them weren't really fun books. They were more serious.
Mm.
And yet there had to be a lightness that I brought to the writing, and a vulnerability. I think that's why the books have been so popular, is that we're all wanting a feeling sense of connection. And and knowing that somebody's gone through hard things and found their way through. And so for me, in all of my books, to go back to when I had really hard transitions in my life, when I got divorced, when business failed, when when there were big struggles, and being honest about the process rather than just like, I've arrived at this wise being, which not helpful. I
Mhm.
know the books that I read that people are vulnerable and share their process were the ones that helped me the most. And so I wanted to bring that to everything that I did. But if I got too serious about it, the writing got really dry and uninteresting. And so there's a storytelling aspect that part is always there's always a joy in like finding the right words and the right languaging and the feeling sense to
Mm.
draw people into a story so that they can relate and find their own stories and be like, oh, this is similar to an experience that I've had. And so
Mm.
that's there's joy in that, I think, every time.
Question. So you
Mm,
mentioned that that core desire, especially when you were younger, to be loved by everyone. And then you mentioned, the need for vulnerability when writing and when, sharing our gifts. Was there ever a part of you that was scared of judgment or criticism when you were writing them of those people who you wanted them to love you?
absolutely. And honestly, I knew the writing was really good when I felt completely nauseous and felt like I do not want to put this into the world. Then I knew I'd actually hit the right level of depth and intimacy with the writing. And I was really sharing from my experience. And yeah, it's very tender. It's scary to put things out into the world that, especially that is our own experiences and places where we made mistakes or struggled with something. And yet, it's what helps, I believe, what helps us the most is getting to those tender places. So, yes, that's how I know that my writing is good. Sometimes is like, I'm like, I hate this. I feel nauseous. I don't want to put it into the world. And I'm like, oh, it must be great.
I love that heart-centered approach to writing. Do you notice the same energy applying to other areas of your life outside of writing? So all these elements that you are cultivating in the writing process, how does it manifest elsewhere?
Absolutely. And I feel like there's such a foundation of like, my own cleaning up of my belief systems and agreements that didn't serve me. So my own spiritual path and healing path. And that touches everything and has really helped the writing. But so much has also helped the challenges in my life. So 2 years ago, we had a wildfire in New Mexico that was completely devastating and the largest wildfire in New Mexico. And I steward 180 acres outside of Santa Fe. And I knew when the fire started, probably not right away, it's a couple weeks into the fire, I suddenly knew that my land was going to get hit. And that there was really, I just had this sense there's nothing we can do. And I'm one of the most optimistic people on the planet. I had friends who were like, we'll pray for you. We can make it not happen. And I was like, it's done. I don't know why, but we're going to lose the ranch. And when the fire came through and something incredibly wild about wildfires now, and that you can track where they are with your phone. And every day we would all be checking where the fire was. And one day I was at the evacuation center and I opened my phone and the fire was in my neighbor's yard and it
Wow.
was coming. And I just sat there and cried for a while. And then I opened my heart and I got really quiet and I was like, what do I do? What do I do? And I had trained myself enough. I've had enough just incredible spiritual teachers and healing moments in my life, and to be able to stop and get really quiet and listen in this incredibly hopeless, hard situation and just stop my mind and open my heart. And the message I got was sing to the trees, be with the trees. Don't run away from this, be with them. And so I literally, for the next hour, just sat and just sang and just imagined being with all those trees that I knew the fire was consuming. And people later said to me, well, weren't you mad at the fire? I have a deep love of fire and
Mhm.
all the elements. And I was like, no, the fire did its thing really well. Like it burned, it did what it was doing. It wasn't personal. And there was a lot of grief after that and a lot of loss. And it showed me something inside of myself where when we practice getting steady inside of ourselves, when something big happens, we can lean back into that steadiness and listen for what's the best medicine for this situation. And it's not from our head, it's from a really different place in our being.
So powerful that the fire was doing what it does and it's not personal. Wow. As you said, it's not personal. And of course, knowing your background, I immediately thought of the four agreements and, don't take things personally and Toltec wisdom. How has studying Toltec wisdom changed your life?
Oh my gosh, so completely. I was part of another spiritual tradition and I'd been teaching it for years. And I had a sense that something was missing. And I couldn't name it, but I knew looking at myself and looking at the people that I was, peers with and also students, that there was this sense, now I would call it empowered victim, where we had done good work of getting more courageous and feeling more powerful, but there was still this sense of unease, would be the best way to describe it. And so I opened and I said to the universe, to the divine, to life, I was like, okay, I need something. I don't know what we're missing, but I need something else. There's some piece of a teaching that I'm missing. And I actually had a dream about Don Miguel, and very clear dream of this human that was going to show up in my life and change my life completely. And I remember waking up and thinking, right, where am I going to meet this human? Like, I live in the middle of Northern California. It's like, was very rural at the time. And a week later, someone came into my office and said, you have to meet this man. And I was like, oh God, he's here. Oh no.
Wow.
And it took me a year because I knew my life was going to change so drastically. I could just feel it. And it did. I met Miguel the next month. He took on a group of apprentices, and I stepped into an apprenticeship with him for the next 6 years. And it so thoroughly changed my life that it took me 3 years to integrate what I had been teaching with Toltec wisdom and to weave the two together. And that's really where Warrior Goddess came from. So the goddess work was the work I was doing before, which was around the cycles and the seasons and really learning how to be in community and circle inside of ourselves and nature and with other women specifically. And what I was missing was the warrior of intent and focus and clarity and undoing the old agreements and beliefs and doing that in a systematic way. And so the result was this bringing together of a more feminine, cyclical, connected to the seasons ceremonial work with that warrior focus clarity that I learned from Miguel.
Wow. So
Incredible.
really that like my shirt says that balance of
Yes.
the two coming together in your work and then, in your life as well. Wow. So powerful. Um, of course, we're here to talk about the wild, willing, and wise. Before we do, can you just very briefly, for those who haven't had a chance to access Warrior Goddess, give a little bit of insight into what that was and, what it covers, because that's life-changing work.
So much. That book came out of a apprenticeship circle that I had taught for 15 years, that I honed over many years of working with people in person and then brought online. And then my publisher saw that kind of the outline for that book and was like, this is it, let's write this book. And it's 10 lessons, 10 specific areas of where I found we as humans have like really struggle with.
Mhm.
And the first one is like lesson one, commit to you. And so often, especially as women, we've committed to other people, to being nice, to caretaking, to being small. We don't even realize it. And so that first foundational lesson is, how do we learn to commit to who we truly are and learn to become authentic? And then I just systematically went through my own life and my students and looked at, where do we need the most support? And so there's teachings around creativity, sexuality, opening our hearts, speaking our truth. And it really builds upon itself in that way, where it helps us to find who we really are by kind of taking one lesson and working through that, and then getting to the next lesson. So that's kind of the background of where that book came from a lot of in-person teaching, and then over the phone, and then it got then really honed in such a beautiful way then into a book.
Yeah, thank you so much for writing it. I absolutely love it. And I highly recommend everyone to grab a copy and to go through those 10 points. Okay, tell us about Wild, Willing, and Wise. What can we
I have,
expect from
I
it?
have this very beat up advanced copy. I'm getting the real copy tomorrow. I'm so excited. It is such a delightful book. I started off studying the three archetypes of maiden, mother, and crone, which again, within the goddess community is a big place of the maiden, of that young energy, and then the mother of starting to nurture and build, and then the crone of then settling into our wisdom. And as I started studying those archetypes more deeply, I had this yearning to create something that would be available to everybody. And that wasn't about age or gender, but was about the energy of those three. And as I started working on it, I wanted a metaphor to go with it. And I picked the metaphor of the river, and a really crazy story that I had of rafting the Grand Canyon when I was younger. And so those three energies, wild, willing, and wise, became three guides that we need on the river of life. So the wild part of us is our creativity and our enthusiasm and our sense of adventure, which we all need a good dose of. And I think a lot of us, especially, have kind of dampened down our wild as we've gotten older, or as things get hard. And that actually, that energy is so precious. And so I talk about balance, like here's an excess of wild, here's deficiency of wild, and here's a lot of different ways of how to get back into right relationship and balance with wild in our lives. And then willing was about the mother energy. But as I was talking to someone, they were like, well, who's more willing than a mother?
Mhm.
And the willing is when you're building something, when you're nurturing something outside of yourself. So wild energy is usually like just about you. The willing is, I'm willing to do hard things in service to something or someone else. You know, whether it's being up in the middle of the night with a sick child, or it's the fourth rewrite of a book, or a project at work that's really dear to you that you have to keep being willing to show up for it. And again, the places where we're deficient in willing, where we're procrastinating, hold ourselves back, and the places where in excess of willing, which is caretaking, like trying to row everybody else's boats. And so how to find our balance. So it's a workbook too. It's a fill in the blank sort of a book, because I also realized we just need something that we can grab onto
Yeah.
and be held through, that's simple enough, but that also gives us insight about ourselves and what to do about it. And then the third quality is wise. That third guide is the part of us that is wise and that sees the length of the river, and that knows that there's going to be rapids and that there's going to be smooth areas, and knows when to paddle and when to rest. So that wise energy, we can also have excess of wise when we're like, I know everything there is to know, and I can tell you what you should be doing. Like there's an aspect of control when we get caught in excess wise. And then we can have a deficient of wisdom, where we are too trusting in a way, or where we aren't holding our own truth. We think everybody else has the wisdom. And so
Mm.
finding that right balance for us.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm so excited to read it, to work through it, because I feel like everyone really like that word balance. And we see so much of this polarity happening in so many different areas on social media, you go and there's so many extremes. It's like either this or that. And I think that what we are all craving is really how do we balance so that we're not on these extreme points, on these polar points.
Oh, true. And I that's part of what I love working with the archetypes is that it's not like this one's right and this one's wrong, or even that excess or deficiency are wrong. They're just, we're learning how to tune
Mhm.
inside of ourselves. And we don't have to make anything wrong. We don't have to be divisive inside of ourselves or in our relationship with other people. And
Mm.
that sense of how do we come back into our heart? Because it's our minds that create the division and the separation. And it's our heart that can see a way through that doesn't have to demean or hurt ourselves or anyone else.
Oof. So powerful. I'm gonna literally quote that last sentence of, not feeling the need to hurt or to tell someone they're wrong or tell ourselves we're wrong, and that grace and compassion and that heart-centered approach. So healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I usually like to ask my guests one question towards the end of the episode, and that is if you could go back to that 7-year-old girl in your instance, what would you tell her knowing what you know today? What's one piece of advice you'd like her to know?
Mm. That it's okay if other people don't like you. Follow your heart and find the ones that love the way you do.
Wow. Love the way you do. So beautiful. Heather Ash, how can people get in touch with you? Where can they get your books? How can they connect with you? Are there courses that you are doing, group projects, group programs? Sorry.
Yeah, yes. Wildwillingwise.com or warriorgoddess.com. And right now, with the website, if people get the book, there's a little video series that I did so that you can get that for free. And I do a lot of online and live stuff. I'll be going on a huge tour and doing a lot of things online as well. And so checking in at warriorgoddess.com or Wild, Willing, and Wise, or you can follow along on Instagram where I am posting in stories where I am, where's Heather Ash now, which is everybody asks that question because nobody knows where I am because I travel so
I
much.
love that. And I'll put both those websites in the show notes so people can just click and get access to it. Once again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, for sharing your time, your energy. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the beautiful good work that you do and blessings.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Speak soon.